Imagine sitting across the dinner table from someone you once loved, someone you vowed to spend your life with. The room is quiet, the air heavy. You watch as they take a bite of their meal, their eyes meeting yours for a brief moment. And then it happens. They clutch their chest, their face contorts in pain, and they collapse onto the floor. You don't scream. You don't call for help. You just sit there watching. Because this wasn't an accident. This was justice. This is the story of Elena Morales, a woman who went from the glitz of the stage to the shadows of vengeance. Over the course of a decade, Elena became the silent savior for countless women trapped in lives of abuse, fear, and despair. She didn't wear a mask or carry a weapon. She didn't leave behind calling cards or cryptic messages. What she left behind were bodies, over 100 of them. Husbands, partners, men who had terrorized the women they claimed to love. Each death was meticulously planned, each one made to look like an accident. A heart attack here, a tragic overdose there. The perfect crimes, committed by a woman who seemed to vanish into thin air. But Elena wasn't always a killer. She was once an actress, a woman who dreamed of fame and happiness, until her own life became a nightmare, until the man she married turned her world into a prison of pain and humiliation, until she decided she'd had enough. What drives a woman to take such extreme measures? How did she manage to operate for so long without being caught? And why, after years of evading the law, did she suddenly disappear, leaving behind only whispers and unanswered questions? This is the story of Elena Morales, the woman who became a shadow, a ghost, a legend. But be warned, this isn't just a tale of revenge. It's a story about power, survival, and the lengths one woman went to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. And by the end, you'll be left wondering, was she a hero, a monster, or something else entirely? Let's begin where it all started, not with the deaths, but with the life that led to them. The life of a woman who was pushed to the edge and decided to jump. Elena Morales wasn't born a killer. She was born a dreamer. Growing up in a small town, she was the girl who lit up every room she walked into. Her smile was magnetic, her talent undeniable. By the time she was in her early 20s, Elena had moved to the city, chasing her dream of becoming an actress. And for a while, it seemed like the world was hers for the taking. She landed roles in local theater productions. Her name began to appear in reviews, and her future looked bright. But then she met Antonio. Antonio Vega was charming, confident, and relentless in his pursuit of her. He wasn't like the other men who vied for her attention. He didn't just shower her with compliments. He made her feel seen, understood, even adored. When he proposed, Elena said yes without hesitation. She believed she had found her happily ever after. The cracks began to show almost immediately. At first, it was little things, a sharp comment here, a cold shoulder there. Then came the accusations. Antonio would accuse Elena of flirting with co-stars, of neglecting him, of not being the wife he deserved. The verbal abuse soon turned physical. Slaps, shoves, and eventually, full-blown beatings became a regular part of Elena's life. She hid the bruises under layers of makeup and the pain behind a forced smile. The final blow came when Elena discovered she was pregnant. For a brief moment, she allowed herself to hope that this child might change things, that Antonio might soften, that they could start over. But hope is a fragile thing. One night, after a particularly brutal argument, Antonio lost control. He hit her repeatedly, screaming that she was worthless, that she would never be a good mother. Elena collapsed, bleeding and broken. The next day, she lost the baby. Devastated and desperate, Elena made a decision. She couldn't live like this anymore. She wouldn't. A week later, Antonio was dead. The official cause of death was listed as a heart attack. Nobody suspected a thing. Antonio was a heavy drinker, and his doctor had warned him multiple times to take his health more seriously. The poison Elena used didn't leave a trace. It merely triggered the heart attack his body had been primed for. Elena didn't mourn Antonio. She didn't cry at his funeral. Instead, she sat in the back row, her face a mask of calm, her mind already racing with plans. Because in that moment, Elena Morales realized something. She wasn't just a victim. She was a survivor. And she had the power to make sure no other woman would suffer as she had. But how far would she go? And what would it cost her? This was only the beginning. Elena's journey from victim to vigilante was just getting started. And the world would never be the same. After Antonio's death, Elena could have disappeared into a quiet life, leaving her past behind. But silence was never an option. She had seen too much, suffered too deeply. And she knew there were other women. Trapped, terrified, living the same nightmare she once had. At first, she sought healing. She joined a support group, hoping to feel whole again, to convince herself that what she had done was justified. Sitting in a circle of strangers, she listened to the broken voices of women who bore the same scars she once hid beneath layers of makeup. Some had escaped, others were still suffering, but all of them shared the same pain. The more she heard, the angrier she became. It wasn't just her story. It wasn't just Antonio. It was happening everywhere. Behind closed doors, in respectable homes, to women of all ages, races, and backgrounds. Restraining orders were ignored. Police reports were dismissed. Abusers walked free, their victims left to live in fear. Justice, it seemed, belonged only to those with power. That was when Elena made her decision. She began to research not just about abusive men but about the justice system itself. She read case files, watched court hearings, and combed through news reports of domestic violence cases. The pattern was always the same. Excuses, loopholes, and a society that turned a blind eye. So, she started taking notes. She focused on men who had evaded punishment, those with wealth, influence, or simply the ability to manipulate the system. These were the ones who believed they were untouchable. But they had never met someone like Elena Morales. Her first target was a well-respected businessman named Victor Delgado. By day, he was a philanthropist, known for his generous donations to women's shelters. By night, he was a monster who terrorized his wife and daughters behind locked doors. Elena followed him for weeks, learning his habits, his routine, his weaknesses. One night, at a charity gala, she slipped a lethal dose of digitalis into his whiskey. The toxin mimicked a fatal heart arrhythmia. When Victor collapsed in the middle of a toast, clutching his chest, guests rushed to his side. But by the time paramedics arrived, he was already gone. The official cause of death? A sudden heart attack. No foul play suspected. That was all the confirmation she needed. From then on, Elena refined her craft. Every kill was precise, carefully planned. Accidents, medical complications, disappearances. She made sure no two deaths looked alike. She experimented with different methods. Poisons that left no trace, staged suicides, carefully orchestrated accidents. She traveled, changed identities, worked under the radar. She became a ghost, a phantom that moved undetected through the cracks of society. But she didn't just kill blindly. She still attended support groups, listening, observing. She sought out the women who needed help the most, the ones still trapped in their own prisons of fear. She wasn't just avenging them. She was setting them free. Her methods were so meticulous that even criminologists struggled to connect the dots. Forensic experts were baffled. Each case appeared to be an isolated tragedy, with no clear link to the others. A leading criminologist, reviewing her work years later, would describe her as a ghost with a scalpel, surgical, invisible, and terrifyingly effective. And by the time authorities began piecing together the truth, it was already too late. With several men dead, how did no one suspect her? For years, Elena Morales was a ghost, a specter that lurked in the shadows, striking with precision, vanishing without a trace. She had perfected the art of the silent kill, eliminating monsters who had spent their lives evading justice. The world never suspected. The authorities never saw the pattern. But even the most careful predator can make a mistake. And Elena's came from an act of compassion. It happened in California. By then, she had built an entirely new identity, not just as another anonymous face in support groups, but as a licensed therapist specializing in counseling abused women. It gave her the perfect cover. Women trusted her, confided in her, and in many cases, unknowingly provided her with the names of the men who needed to disappear. One of those women was Sarah Mitchell. Young, barely in her 20s, she was married to a man twice her age. At every session, Sarah arrived covered in bruises, her voice trembling as she recounted the horrors of her home life. The broken voice, the fear, the hopelessness. Sarah was living Elena's past. Elena knew what had to be done, but she had learned caution over the years, no direct involvement, no risks. So instead of approaching Sarah, she sent her an anonymous message, a link to a website detailing resources, escape plans, and ways to disappear. What she didn't know was that Sarah's husband, Daniel Mitchell, had already taken steps to ensure his wife never had secrets. He had cloned her phone. Every text, every call, every website she visited. It all went straight to him. The moment Sarah clicked the link, Daniel saw it. And he wasn't just furious. He was suspicious. Sarah didn't even know who had sent it, but Daniel was convinced someone was helping her. He took the evidence to the police, spinning a story about an unknown person targeting men like him. He painted himself as the victim, a man whose wife was being manipulated by a dangerous outsider. The police took the claim seriously, not because they believed Daniel, but because when they ran a basic search, a disturbing trend emerged. One detective, a seasoned officer named Detective Mark Caldwell, started pulling old case files. At first, it seemed like coincidence. Men with histories of abuse dying suddenly years apart across different states. But the deeper he looked, the more he realized it wasn't random. Heart attacks in otherwise healthy men. Car accidents that seemed too perfectly timed. Suicides without warning signs. 1 or 2 could be brushed off as tragedy. 100? That was something else entirely. The FBI got involved. Analysts combed through records trying to find the link. And then they found it. Support groups. Across multiple states in different years, there was one consistent factor. A therapist. A therapist who never stayed in one place for too long. A therapist whose clients, women from these very support groups, had one strange thing in common. Their abusive husbands kept dying. But there was a problem. Nobody knew her real name. She changed identities. She altered her appearance. Even when law enforcement cross-referenced her records, they found nothing but layers of fabricated identities. Investigators began attending support group meetings undercover, posing as victims, hoping to catch a glimpse of the mysterious therapist. But she never appeared twice in the same place. Desperate for answers, the police turned to the only people who might have known her. The widows. They brought them in for questioning one by one. But every single widow told the same story. They didn't know who she was, even though they were the ones who had wanted her services. Even though she had given them exactly what they needed. By the time law enforcement realized how deeply she had embedded herself into the system, it was too late. Elena Morales had vanished. Her apartment, empty. Her bank accounts, drained. Any trace of her existence, wiped clean. Will she leave Sarah alone and let her suffer all her life, or will Sarah be brave enough to leave the marriage? For years, Elena Morales had been a shadow, a silent force of retribution against men who believed they were untouchable. But as law enforcement tightened the net around her, she knew her time was running out. She needed to disappear, but not before one final kill. Daniel Mitchell. Unlike her past targets, Daniel had an advantage. He was already suspicious. After intercepting the mysterious link on Sarah's phone and reporting it to the police, he had become increasingly paranoid. He changed his routine. He monitored his meals. He avoided strangers. But none of that mattered, because Elena had already found his weakness. Daniel had a habit, one that no one paid attention to. Every evening, he drank a particular brand of imported whiskey, a rare bottle that he ordered exclusively for himself. He never shared it, not with guests, not even with Sarah. It was his indulgence, a ritual he maintained every night after locking his wife away in their home. And it was through this habit that Elena would strike. The plan had been in motion for weeks. Posing as an anonymous distributor, she had arranged for a special delivery, an identical bottle of his favorite whiskey, expertly tampered with. She had injected a precise amount of a rare, slow-acting neurotoxin into the liquid. The poison wasn't lethal in a single dose, but with each sip, it would accumulate in his system, breaking him down from the inside. On the first night, Daniel drank as usual. He felt nothing. By the second night, he had a slight headache, nothing out of the ordinary. By the third, his limbs felt heavier, as if his body was fighting off exhaustion. His hands trembled when he reached for his glass, but he dismissed it. Stress, he told himself. By the fourth night, he began waking up drenched in sweat. His heartbeat felt irregular, but he refused to acknowledge it. He still drank. By the fifth night, Sarah noticed a change in him. His skin looked paler, his breathing labored. He snapped at her more than usual, his frustration growing as his body deteriorated. By the sixth night, Daniel struggled to get out of bed. His vision blurred, his muscles ached, and for the first time, fear settled in. He called a doctor who ran tests but found nothing conclusive. They advised him to rest, attributing his symptoms to exhaustion. But by the seventh night, it was too late. That evening, Daniel poured his final drink. As he swallowed, his body began to convulse. His muscles locked, his throat tightened, and his heart pounded violently. He tried to call for help, but his voice barely left his lips. Gasping, clutching his chest, he collapsed onto the floor, his body seizing violently. By the time Sarah found him, he was gone. The official cause of death? Heart failure. Another tragic, unexplained case. Elena had done it again. While Daniel's death was ruled as natural, the police knew it wasn't. They had already been watching Sarah, and by extension, whoever had been guiding her from the shadows. A week after Daniel's passing, authorities raided what they believed to be Elena's hideout. What they found chilled them to the core. A small, rented storage unit, empty except for a single desk. Inside the desk drawers were dozens of meticulously organized files. Each contained details of her past victims, their crimes, their routines, their deaths. Some files were years old, yellowed with time. Others were recent, fresh, as if she had planned to continue. There were maps, notes, even psychological profiles of her targets. One detective described it as a serial killer's war room, but instead of trophies, she kept records of justice. But there was one thing missing: Elena herself. No trace of her identity remained. No fingerprints. No DNA. Even the surveillance cameras in the area had been wiped clean. It was as if she had never existed. The discovery of her hideout sent shockwaves through law enforcement. Experts weighed in on the case, trying to piece together the mind of the woman who had evaded capture for so long. A forensic psychologist speculated on her fate. Elena Morales isn't a typical serial killer. She wasn't driven by bloodlust, but by a calculated need to deliver justice. That kind of drive doesn't simply vanish. Either she retired, knowing the walls were closing in, or she's still out there, waiting for the right moment to strike again. Despite years of investigation, no solid evidence ever surfaced to confirm her whereabouts. Some believed she had fled the country, living under yet another false identity. Others theorized she had gone deeper underground, continuing her work from the shadows. But one thing was certain: Elena had left a mark that would never fade. And the final question haunted law enforcement for years. Is Elena still out there, watching, waiting, and killing? Even in her disappearance, Elena Morales left a legacy. One that reverberated across the country, across generations, and through every woman who ever felt trapped in a toxic, dangerous relationship. She had become a myth, a figure whispered about in support groups, a symbol of hope and vengeance wrapped into one. But the world would never know if Elena was a hero or a villain. And maybe that was her genius. By operating in the shadows, she allowed the world to debate her actions without ever truly knowing who she was. In interviews with crime experts, the opinions were divided. Some saw her as a cold-blooded killer, someone who had crossed the line from victim to executioner. They argued that her actions undermined the very justice system she had once hoped to reform. But others saw her differently. A woman who had been pushed to the brink by years of abuse, someone who had turned her pain into power, righting the wrongs the legal system had failed to address. A former detective who had investigated her case said, "Elena wasn't a traditional killer. She didn't take joy in the deaths of these men. She didn't view herself as a criminal. She was simply driven. Driven by a need for justice, by a sense of responsibility to protect the women who couldn't protect themselves. And maybe that's what makes her both a hero and a villain in our eyes." In support groups, Elena's name was spoken with reverence. For many, she was a symbol. A woman who had faced the worst of what the world had to offer and turned it into a fight for survival. Her story became a rallying cry, a beacon for women who were still trapped in their own dangerous situations. One survivor, Emily Turner, shared her own experience in a private interview. "I was in an abusive relationship for years. Couldn't get out. The fear was too overwhelming. And then I heard about Elena. At first, I thought she was just a legend. But then I realized she did what I couldn't. She got out. She fought back. She gave me the strength to leave. I didn't think I had it in me. But Elena's story showed me I wasn't alone." Emily's escape wasn't immediate, nor easy, but Elena had sparked something inside her. A fire, a drive to take control of her own life. Emily's story was just one of many that had been inspired by the Shadow Avengers campaign of justice. But with admiration came questions. What were the true consequences of Elena's actions? What was the cost of her vigilante justice? Could anyone truly justify taking the law into their own hands, no matter how noble the cause? A sociologist weighed in on the ethics of vigilante justice, offering a sobering perspective. In a society where the legal system is designed to protect people, vigilante justice creates a dangerous precedent. It raises fundamental questions. Who gets to decide who lives or dies? What happens when the law is broken by those who claim to be saving the very society they're undermining? Elena's story is an extreme case, but it highlights a deeper, more troubling truth. What do we do when the system fails us? The legacy of Elena Morales is still felt today. She was both a cautionary tale and a symbol of power, a woman who took control when she felt powerless. She became a legend to some, a villain to others. Yet, no one can deny the impact she had on the lives of countless women who found strength in her actions. Her story raised a haunting question, one that still lingers in the air. How far is too far? As we reflect on the chilling tale of Elena Morales, it's impossible to ignore the impact of her actions, both the justice she delivered and the haunting questions that remain unanswered. Her story is a reminder of the dark realities faced by those trapped in abusive relationships, and the lengths to which some will go to protect themselves and those they love. If you or someone you know is experiencing abuse, remember, you are not alone. Seek help. Whether it's a trusted friend, a counselor, or a support group, there are resources available to guide you through the darkness. If Elena's story can teach us anything, it's that change is possible. And sometimes the greatest strength comes from reaching out. Maybe, just maybe, if you listen closely, Elena will hear you. And your cry for justice won't go unanswered. If you found this story gripping, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell for more chilling true crime content. And tell us in the comments, do you think Elena was a hero or a criminal? Your thoughts could inspire the next conversation. Coming up next, the unsolved case of the Phantom Arsonist. A series of mysterious fires that shook a small town to its core. Who was behind them? Join us to uncover the secrets. Until then, stay curious and stay safe.